Kansas Territory, late summer of 1871. The dust had not yet settled when the girl stepped onto the auction block, holding her baby so tight her knuckles turned white. The town of Dry Creek had seen its share of cruel things, but the silence that fell over the crowd that day was different. Men shifted uncomfortably in their boots. Women looked away. She was young, no more than 20, and her dress was worn through at the knees. Her hair was tied back in a rough braid, but it did not hide the bruising near her jaw. The baby, maybe 8 months old, whimpered against her chest. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Lot number 72, one female, young, fit for housework, and her child. No one moved. The girl looked straight ahead, chin high, even though her hands trembled. A man at the back spat into the dirt and muttered, "Ain't no use for a woman with a babe." Another laughed low. "Should have left the baby behind." Still, no one bid. From the edge of the crowd, a tall man stepped forward. He had not spoken all morning, just leaned against the hitching post with his hat low and arms crossed. Now he walked slow, steady, like he had all the time in the world. His name was Fletcher Tannem. He was a cattleman, quiet, steady, and known to keep to himself. Folks said he had buried a brother the year before and had not spoken more than 10 words in a day since. Fletcher looked up at the girl, then the baby, then back to her eyes. "I will take her," he said. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the finality in it. "And the baby, too." The crowd stirred. The auctioneer blinked. "You sure, sir?" I said what I said. The girl's eyes went wide. She did not speak. Fletcher stepped forward, pulled a few bills from his coat pocket, and handed them over. "That enough?" The auctioneer nodded, stunned. "Why, yes, sir." Without another word, Fletcher turned to the girl. "Come on, you are safe now." She hesitated for only a second, then she stepped down, clutching her baby close, and followed him past the crowd that had no use for her. Fletcher did not look back. They rode out of Dry Creek with the sun slanting gold across the hills, the baby quiet between them on the saddle. Fletcher's ranch sat 5 miles out, nothing fancy, just a 2-room cabin, a barn, and a windmill that creaked when the wind blew west. She had not spoken until they reached the front gate, then her voice came soft and cracked. "My name is Josephine Zeller." Fletcher stopped the horse, looked at her. "Josephine," he repeated. "That your son?" She nodded and adjusted the baby in her arms. "His name is Henry." Fletcher dismounted and reached up to help her down. She let him. Her legs were stiff, but she did not stumble. "You have somewhere else to go?" he asked once her boots hit the ground. She shook her head. "No." "Then this is your home now," he said simply. "You and Henry both." That first night, Josephine sat by the fire, feeding Henry while Fletcher laid down a bed of fresh linens in the corner. He had not expected company, but he had always kept things clean, neat, maybe out of habit, maybe out of loneliness. She watched him move, quiet, efficient. "You did not have to take me," she said after a while. Fletcher paused, turned. "I know." "Why did you?" He met her eyes. There was no pity in his face, just something steady, unshakable, because no one else did. She swallowed hard. "My husband. He died in a mining collapse last winter. His family blamed me, said I was cursed. I tried to clean houses in town, but folks would not trust me with a baby on my hip. When the rent came due and I could not pay, the landlord called the sheriff, said I was vagrant." Fletcher nodded once. Then he sat down across from her and pulled off his boots. "Well, you are not anymore." The next morning, Josephine rose early and went out to the clothesline. She had not asked, she just did it. Fletcher watched from the porch, coffee in hand, while she hung the linens with one hand and held Henry in the other. She turned, caught him watching, and offered a small smile. He tipped his hat. She went back to her work. Days passed. Then a week. Josephine cooked, cleaned, helped mend tack. She never complained, not even when Henry cried through the night. Fletcher fixed the chicken coop and made her a cradle from cedar planks. He left it by her bed without a word. One evening after supper, she said, "You built that." He looked up from the fire. Seemed like he needed a place to sleep. Josephine's throat tightened. "Thank you." Fletcher nodded once. Then he stood and handed her a cup of tea. "You do not owe me anything," he said quietly. "You can stay here as long as you like. No strings." She looked up at him. "And if I want to stay for good," he paused, "then this is your home." The nights grew cooler. Josephine started leaving the door open when Fletcher returned from the fields, Henry crawling to greet him. One night, Fletcher lifted the baby into his arms with the same care he gave his cattle, slow and sure. Josephine watched, arms folded, a smile tugging at her mouth. "He likes you," she said softly. Fletcher looked down at the boy. "He is a good kid." Then his eyes met hers, and he added, "Takes after his mother." Her smile faded into something warmer. She walked forward, stood close, heart beating hard. "I never thought I would feel safe again," she whispered. Fletcher reached up and touched her cheek just once. "You are safe now." She leaned into his touch, closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long while she believed it. By late September, the cottonwoods along the creek behind the house had turned the color of brass. Their leaves whispered in the breeze, tossing light across the water and casting shifting patterns on the packed dirt trail. Josephine walked each morning with Henry balanced on her hip. Fletcher had added a rail to the porch steps after she nearly slipped carrying a bucket one dewy morning. He didn't mention it, just nailed it in place after supper and went to bed. Josephine noticed the next day and ran her hand along the smooth, sanded wood, but she didn't bring it up either. One afternoon, while Henry napped in his cedar cradle, Josephine was mending a tear in one of Fletcher's shirts at the table. She glanced up as the cabin door creaked open and saw him carrying a calf, its neck limp, dark eyes dull. "Snake bite," he said, hitching the door shut with his boot. "Found her down by the west fence." Josephine stood, wiping her hands. "Is she breathing?" "Barely." They worked side by side, rinsing the wound with boiled water and packing it with crushed yarrow from the bundle she'd hung in the rafters days earlier. Fletcher held the calf's head while Josephine forced mash between its teeth, her voice low and steady as she coaxed it to swallow. "You've done this before," Fletcher said, not as a question. "My father kept goats in Missouri," Josephine answered. "He never had the money for a doctor, so we did what we could." Fletcher nodded once, then looked down at her hands. "You've got a good touch." Josephine didn't look up. "It's easier to be useful than to be pitied." He said nothing for a moment. "Then you've never asked me why I live alone." She tied off a strip of linen around the calf's leg before speaking. "I figured if you wanted me to know, you'd tell me." Fletcher let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "She was going east, my brother's wife. She wanted to take my niece to Wichita where her people were. Caleb, my brother, he was set on staying, said he'd never leave the land. He was hauling stone for her hearth when it happened. The wagon tipped." Josephine looked up, her needle paused mid-stitch. "The load crushed him," Fletcher finished. "She left the next day, didn't even stay for the burial." Josephine didn't speak, but her eyes stayed on him. "I never blamed her," he added. "Just didn't know what to do with the quiet after." They sat in silence after that, the calf breathing faintly between them. The next day, Josephine found a pair of baby boots left on the rocker beside the hearth. Soft leather, careful stitching too fine to have come from town. She picked them up, tracing the seams with her finger. "Where'd you get these?" Fletcher shrugged. "Traded for 'em 2 springs ago, figured I'd have use one day." She held them close, her voice low. "You did." That night, after Henry was asleep and the dishes put away, Josephine stepped outside where Fletcher was splitting kindling beneath the moonlight. She took the axe from his hands without asking and set a log on the stump. "You ever think about going back east?" she asked, bringing the blade down clean. He watched the split wood fall apart. "No, not even for a fresh start. This is the only start I've got." Josephine set another log. "You're not the only one." He didn't move. "You thinking of leaving?" She shook her head. "I'm thinking of putting down roots." Fletcher reached over and took the axe back, his hand brushing hers. "Then I'll make sure the ground's ready." She didn't say anything, but she didn't move either. Later, when the fire had burned low and the baby stirred in his sleep, Fletcher stood at the doorway of the cabin and watched Josephine cradle Henry close, her lips moving in a lullaby too soft to catch. She didn't see him watching. But he stayed there anyway, until the child's breath evened out and Josephine's head tipped against the wall, her eyelids heavy. Something quiet and certain settled in his chest. He turned back toward the dark, the stars sharp above the prairie, and the wind just beginning to smell like frost. The first frost came during the second week of October. Fletcher had just finished stacking the last of the split wood beneath the eaves when Josephine stepped outside with Henry bundled against her chest. both of them wrapped in shawls she'd sewn from an old quilt she found in the loft. "You'll want to cover that rain barrel," she said, nodding toward it. "I will," Fletcher replied, brushing sawdust from his palms. "Didn't think it'd come this early." Josephine adjusted Henry in her arms. "Cold came early the year my mother passed. She always said you could smell winter in the dirt before the wind turned." Fletcher looked past her toward the line of bare fields. "She sounds like she paid attention." She did. Especially when it mattered. That night, Josephine lit a lamp instead of the fire, setting it on the table while she sorted dry beans into a crock. Fletcher was patching a saddle strap near the hearth, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I've been thinking about the kitchen," she said after a while. "There's room to fit a root cellar in the slope behind it if you're not using the space." Fletcher didn't glance up. "You planning to stay long enough to fill it?" Josephine paused in her sorting. "That depends." "You ready to let me?" He set the strap aside and leaned back. "I've been waiting for you to say it." She looked at him then, eyes steady. "I want to make a life here, not just sleep in your extra bed and sweep your floors." "You've already made more than that," he said. "But I'll build that cellar with you. We can dig it together when the ground's soft enough." Her smile was faint but sure. That Sunday, Fletcher hitched the wagon and asked Josephine if she'd go into town with him. She hesitated at first, fingers tightening on the hem of her coat. "You don't have to," he said, "but I want you there, with me." She turned toward the cradle. "We'll need to wrap him good." They rode in without speaking much, the road rutted from recent rains. Henry fussed until Josephine sang low in his ear, and Fletcher watched her from the corner of his eye, his shoulders settling as the baby quieted. At the mercantile, folks stared. A few nodded, some didn't. Fletcher kept close, his palm steady on the small of Josephine's back as she stepped through the door. Behind the counter, Mrs. Langley blinked twice. "Well, didn't know you'd taken on a family, Mr. Tannem." "She's not taken on," Fletcher said. "She lives with me." Josephine met the woman's gaze without flinching. "We're looking for canning jars, and a kettle if you've got one deep enough for sealing." Mrs. Langley's mouth worked for a moment, then she turned and fetched what they asked for. Outside, Fletcher helped Josephine back into the wagon, lifting Henry into her arms once she'd settled. She glanced down at the child, then over at him. "No one's ever stood beside me like that before," she said. "I wasn't standing," Fletcher replied. "I was just where I belong." The wind picked up on the ride home, and Josephine tucked the blanket tighter around Henry's legs. Fletcher reached over, pulling it higher across her lap without a word. They didn't speak again until they returned to the ranch. As Fletcher unhitched the team, Josephine carried Henry inside and laid him in the cradle. She stood there a moment, watching him breathe, her hand resting on the edge. When Fletcher stepped through the door, she didn't turn. "I've thought about what it means," she said quietly. "To stay. Not just for the season, but for good." He closed the door behind him. "And I'm not afraid of the work or the quiet, but I need to know you're not waiting for someone else." He crossed the room slow. "There's no one else." She turned to face him. "Then I want to be your wife." Fletcher didn't speak right away. He raised his hand, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, then let it fall. "You already are," he said. Josephine's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just stepped into his arms and stayed there, his chest solid beneath her cheek, his hand warm against her back. Outside, the wind rattled the eaves. Inside, everything held. The morning they walked to the preacher's house, there was frost on the ground thick enough to crunch under their boots. Fletcher wore his best coat, brushed clean and mended at the shoulder, while Josephine wrapped Henry in a wool shawl she'd dyed with walnut hulls just days before. They didn't speak much on the way. The trail was quiet, and the only sound was the baby's soft breathing and the slow rhythm of their steps. Josephine kept her hand close to Fletcher's, not touching but near. He glanced at her once, and she gave a small nod. Reverend Haskell met them at the door, his hair more silver than the last time Fletcher had seen him, though his back was still straight. "You come to make a promise?" he asked. Josephine shifted Henry in her arms. "We already made it. Just need someone to witness." The preacher smiled faintly and stepped aside. "Then come in and warm yourselves." There were no pews, just 4 chairs and a stove that burned slow. A single window let in enough light to cast pale beams across the worn rug. Fletcher stood beside Josephine with his hands folded in front of him, the brim of his hat held low at his side. "Do you have rings?" the preacher asked. Josephine shook her head. "We have bread and we have salt." Fletcher took the small cloth bundle from his pocket and unwrapped the crust of sourdough and pinch of coarse salt she'd prepared that morning. He laid them on the table, and the preacher nodded once. "Then by the bread you'll share and the salt you'll keep, I declare your bond sealed." Josephine looked up, her eyes steady. Fletcher met her gaze, and neither of them blinked. "You may kiss her if you wish." Fletcher stepped closer but didn't rush. He touched her cheek with the side of his hand, then leaned in and pressed his mouth to hers, light and sure. Josephine's fingers curled against his coat, and Henry stirred between them, reaching out with one small hand and grabbing Fletcher's collar. They both laughed, soft and surprised. The walk home was warmer, though the sun hadn't risen much higher. Josephine tucked a sprig of cedar into her braid, and Fletcher reached over to brush a leaf from her shoulder. That afternoon, she unpacked the trunk she'd kept closed since arriving. Inside were only 2 dresses, a worn bonnet, and a tin box of keepsakes. A dried bloom from her wedding day to Henry's father, a letter never sent, and a silver locket with no chain. She set the locket aside and placed the other items in a small drawer she'd cleared in the corner chest. Then she opened the back door and stepped out into the yard, where Fletcher was oiling the hinges on the barn gate. "I'd like to plant something next spring," she said. "Not just vegetables, something that lasts." Fletcher straightened, wiping his hands. "What would you plant?" "Lilacs." "My mother had a bush by our porch. It bloomed late, but it always came back." He nodded. "We'll set roots this winter then. You tell me where, and I'll dig the hole." Josephine took a breath and looked out across the field beyond the chicken run. "By the fence." "Where the sun stays late." That night she carried Henry to the bedroom and laid him down, then returned to the main room to find Fletcher by the hearth, the fire low and steady. He was carving a length of pine, careful and slow. "What's it to be?" she asked, sitting beside him. "A rail for the crib," he said. "He'll be standing before long." She watched his hands work. "You think of things before they come. I try to, for you both." When she reached out and laid her hand over his, he stopped carving. He set the blade aside and turned his palm upward, lacing their fingers together. "You don't ever have to prove anything," she said. "You've already done more than most would." Fletcher didn't answer. He just leaned in and pressed his forehead to hers, their joined hands resting between them. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, and the moon climbed above the ridge, casting its pale light over the roof where 2 people had chosen each other quietly, fully, for all the days ahead. By mid-November, the wind from the north turned sharp enough to sting the skin. Fletcher had boarded the outer windows and strung thick canvas across the barn doors. Inside the cabin, the mornings began with the hiss of steam from the kettle, and the scent of firewood heating slow in the cast iron stove. Josephine rose before dawn now, not from habit but from the quiet pull of rhythm her life no longer borrowed, but built. She was kneading dough when Fletcher came in from the cold, his coat dusted with hoarfrost and his breath curling in the air. "Fence held through the night," he said, hanging his hat on the peg. "Snow's coming behind it, though, maybe tomorrow." Without looking up, Josephine said, "There's a quilt top I never finished." "I was thinking today might be the day." Fletcher leaned his shoulder against the wall and watched her fold the dough. "You always have something in your hands," she glanced at him. "Idle hands make anxious thoughts." He crossed the room then, slow but certain, and rested both palms on the table beside hers. "I was thinking of building you a frame, for sewing, one that stands on its own so you don't have to work bent over." Her fingers paused in the flour. "You do that," he nodded, "if you'll use it." Josephine folded the dough once more and set it in the tin pan to rise, then she wiped her hands and turned to face him. "I'd use anything you made for me." Fletcher's mouth curved not in amusement, but a quiet kind of pride. "Then I'll start after supper." That afternoon, Josephine lit a beeswax taper and opened the cedar trunk at the foot of the bed. Inside, tucked beneath the shawl she'd worn out of Dry Creek, lay the unfinished quilt pieces, triangles, and stars, cut from bits of her old dresses and scraps from Henry's swaddles. She laid them out on the table, smoothing each one with care. Fletcher set to work in the corner, shaping the legs of the frame with a hand plane, the shavings curling at his feet. Henry sat nearby on a wool blanket, banging a wooden spoon against an empty tin without complaint. Josephine looked over once and said, "My mother taught me the star pattern when I was 9. She said it was the shape a home made when you looked at it from far enough away." Fletcher didn't look up. "Then it's fitting." She watched the way his hands moved, precise and without wasted motion. "Did your brother teach you woodwork?" Fletcher set the plane aside. "He taught me cattle, the rest came after." She folded a strip of blue calico and pinned it. "Do you think he'd have liked me?" Fletcher met her eyes. "He'd have liked how you see things." That night, with the fire low and the frame standing ready, Josephine sewed beneath a blanket while Fletcher read aloud from a leather-bound almanac he'd kept since he was a boy. His voice was quiet but steady, the words rounding smooth in the warm air between them. Afterward, she moved to the cradle and lifted Henry, who stirred but didn't wake. Fletcher watched her cradle the boy against her chest, her cheek resting lightly against his downy hair. When she turned, she found him still watching. "You ever think much about what comes next?" she asked. Fletcher crossed to her and reached for Henry, holding the child with an ease that had grown over weeks. "I think about spring and planting oats." "And fixing the well crank." "And us?" she asked. He looked at her then, eyes steady. "I've thought about building on a second room so Henry has space when he's big enough to want it." Josephine's throat tightened. "That sounds like a plan." Fletcher reached out and took her hand, rough fingers curling round hers. "I don't plan for things I don't mean to keep." She stepped closer. "Neither do I." The snow came soft and slow the next morning, blanketing the yard and fencing in silence. Fletcher harnessed the mule and brought in the last of the feed sacks, stacking them in the pantry while Josephine set preserves on the shelves they'd built together. At dusk, she boiled beans with ham bone and served it with fresh bread, her apron dusted with flour she hadn't noticed. After supper, Fletcher drew her toward the fire, Henry already asleep in the cradle. They didn't speak, just sat together, her head on his shoulder, his arm curled around her waist. When the oil lamp flickered low, Josephine turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd have this." Fletcher didn't answer with words. He leaned forward and kissed her slow, certain nothing rushed. When they parted, he rested his brow against hers and said, "You were never a passing thing, Josephine." She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his words settle between her ribs. "Then let's not look back anymore." By early March, the snow had melted into the gullies and the creek ran high with meltwater. Fletcher dug the foundation for the new room while Josephine stitched curtains for the window that would face east. Henry took his first steps in the yard, arms flailing, feet unsteady but upright. Josephine laughed when he fell into the soft earth and looked up, surprised but unhurt. Fletcher lifted the boy high and spun him once before setting him on his feet again. That night they stood on the porch beneath a sky thick with stars. Fletcher's hand found Josephine's and held it, thumb brushing the back of her knuckles. "We'll plant lilacs tomorrow," he said. "The ground's ready." Her smile was tired but sure. "So am I." Inside, the fire warmed the walls of the home they'd built not from chance, but choice. The cradle sat empty now, Henry asleep in a cot Fletcher had shaped with his own hands. Josephine's quilt lay folded across the foot of their bed, finished and bound. They stood together at the threshold, no longer waiting. And when Fletcher pulled her close and she leaned against him, it wasn't with the weight of sorrow or fear, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found her way and the man who'd walked beside her, step for step, into the life they'd made together. Always.